All right, welcome back. Our fourth session. How do we dig out of this fiscal catastrophe and get the economy moving again? I'm Danielle Smith, host of 770 CHQR and the Danielle Smith Show in Calgary. Normally I give a bit of an opening so that we are on the same page with the same set of facts. This will be very brief because I think we all have the same set of facts. Number one, we're all screwed. Number two, it's at all levels of government. Nobody's figured this out. Number three, no one knows what to do. Number four, the left seems to think that we can just print money forever through modern monetary theory. I'm hoping one of our panelists can explain that to you because I'm still trying to figure it out, and that it won't impact inflation or interest rates, and we can keep on borrowing forever. And the right seems to think that we can just wait until things return to normal, revenues will be restored, and there isn't anything that needs to be done on the cutting side. So I don't know if that is going to be a recipe for getting us back into balance, but we're going to find out. We've got some great panelists today. Jake Fuss is economist at the Fraser Institute. We've also got Ross McKitrick. He's a professor of economics at the University of Guelph, specializing in the environment, energy, and climate. We have Laura Jones, who is the Chief Strategic Officer and Executive Vice President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and Jocelyn Bamford, founder of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Ontario. So let's get right into it with Jake Fuss, who's going to give us just a bit of an opening for us to tell us, maybe he has all the answers. How are we going to dig ourselves out of this fiscal catastrophe, Jake?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Danielle. And it's great to be on the panel and joining everyone for an important discussion about economic recovery today. Obviously the provinces and federal government have been spending tens of billions of dollars right now during the pandemic and running rather large deficits. But one thing that's probably not necessarily understood to the same extent is kind of the scale of the problem and how we compare to other countries. So just, kind of looking at the economic and fiscal problems, if we look at recent data from the IMF, Canada actually has the highest deficit as a share of the economy among 35 high-income countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom. We're also the sixth largest in terms of government spending as a share of the economy among those same countries. And then on the economic side, right now we have an unemployment rate hovering around that 9% range, obviously much higher than we had before the pandemic. It's one of the highest rates in the G7. And we've had a significant contraction in the economy, much higher than the 2008-2009 crisis. But as we start to set the stage for economic recovery, I think it's going to be important for us to start to address some of the issues that existed prior to the pandemic even starting. So that means fixing things like attracting business investment, tax competitiveness, large size of government, complex regulatory system, and a lack of focus on economic growth. So those are some of the problems I would look for us to start to solve in that economic recovery stage.
All right, thanks for that, Jake. I think we'll do this one a little bit differently. We'll just do a round table to get everybody's initial thoughts, and then we'll try to do a deep dive into it. So let's go now to Ross McKitrick, University of Guelph economics professor. What's your thought? How do we get ourselves out of this fiscal catastrophe?
Well, I think Jake's made a good point that things that were problems before the pandemic are still problems, and then we're now in a position also where we have a lot less wealth to try to deal with them and a high unemployment rate. It's an unusual sort of recession because obviously it was induced in order to shut down the economy to deal with the pandemic as opposed to the banking crisis in 2008. But the similar effect has been to rapidly increase the money supply, dramatically expand the government's fiscal position. Now, Canada got out of the 2008 hole on the monetary side after expanding the money supply. The Bank of Canada then was able to unwind its balance sheet and bring it back roughly to a normal state. And also the government's stimulus measures back then were temporary. So they came to an end. And in this case, I assume the Bank of Canada is going to try to do the same thing, which is avoid permanent expansion of the money supply. But the worrisome thing about this government is that they seem to see this as an opportunity to permanently expand spending, and they don't seem troubled by the magnitude of the deficit. If it turns out to be the case, and I'm at a loss, I think a lot of my colleagues in economics are at a loss of how countries like the US were able to expand their money supply so much and engage in so much fiscal stimulus in 2008 and again today without triggering inflation. If that turns out to be possible, then I don't see why we have income taxes. If we could just have as much free money as we want, anytime we want, then let's reorganize the entire government around that principle. But I really do think at the end of the day, endless monetary and fiscal expansion has to be inflationary. And we won't realize that it's happening until it's too late to prevent it from happening. And so getting out of the mess that we're in means trying to preempt getting into an inflationary spiral and dealing with it now when we seem to have lead time to deal with it.
Okay, Professor, I think now you've got everybody cheering the idea that we can just keep on printing money and eliminate income taxes. But tell us how economic theory on this is supposed to work. Because I remember my economics prof, Dr. Frank Atkins, telling me that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Eventually, as you print more money, it's just going to show up in prices, and you're going to have to trigger higher interest rates to bring it down. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we had double-digit interest rates. So what has changed? Like, why is it that we think we can print forever, but it didn't work in Zimbabwe, for instance, where they have trillion-dollar notes, or in Venezuela, where they've got a similar runaway inflation problem? What am I missing?
I'm probably not the right person to ask, because whenever I go looking for an answer to that question, what I see are commentaries from monetary economists who are stumped on the same issue, especially with regards to the 2008 banking crisis. The U.S. Federal Reserve dramatically expanded the money supply, and they never really withdrew it. They essentially tripled the money supply and then kept it there. And somehow it didn't translate into inflation. Now, at the same time, things like the velocity of circulation went way down and never recovered. So that may have offset the inflationary effect. But no, here in Canada, our central bank was actually quite prudent in the way that they injected a lot of liquidity into the banking system, but then they were able to withdraw it afterwards. And so we never had that risk. Right now, with the amount of borrowing that's happened to fund all the CERB, all the pandemic relief programs and so on, it's all just gone onto the public balance sheet. It's all just debt. Eventually what will happen is we will start having to pay more to service that debt. And once people start realizing how much of our annual economic growth has to go to just servicing the debt, then we run into the problem that both Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien faced when they took office, which was suddenly the bond market doesn't like Canada anymore. And it's only going to take a couple of percentage points increase in interest rates to have an enormous effect on federal and provincial budgets. And I would expect there's a lot of people within the federal civil service who worry about that. I don't think it's necessarily something that the government itself seems to be worried about.
All right. We'll see if either of our other panelists want to deal with the issue of modern monetary theory. I've done, I think, 3 segments on it, and I still don't get it. But the idea that you can just keep on printing money and never have to pay it back seems to be at the core of it. And so let's go to Laura Jones, who is with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. I don't know if you want to take a stab at that one, but let me sort of put it to you this way. I mean, what I worry about is that once those additional interest rates go up and the interest payments go up, it often falls disproportionately on the business community to start paying it back. And so give me a sort of a state of where things are at. How much of a fiscal catastrophe is it for your members?
Well, I think COVID-19 has really been a nightmare for Main Street. Nightmare on Main Street is kind of the headline with this. And when we look at how small businesses are doing, we look at a couple of key indicators that we're putting out there every week. And one is the number that are back to full sales, the number that are back to full employment, and the number that are fully open. And those numbers are still very, very low, particularly when we look at revenues. So only 30% of small businesses are back to kind of pre-COVID normal revenue situation. About 40% are back to full staffing, but that's with a big wage subsidy in place. So, that's not really as accurate as it might be without that support in place. And then you've got about 2/3 fully open. So Those are pretty worrying stats, and they're not moving. And Danielle, you asked the question about, what do we need to get out of this? I would say first we need the right supports so that businesses can bridge back to recovery. And a lot of that work has been done now, still a little bit outstanding. But the second thing is we need to get businesses off of those recovery measures. And what that requires is consumer confidence. We need to move the needle on that, only 30% back to normal sales. And it's tough for consumers to be confident in the midst of a pandemic when every day they're hearing, record numbers of new cases. And I know you had a panel talk about that a little bit earlier, about how we position, the kind of trade-offs on safety and health and our and the importance of a strong economy. But consumer confidence is going to be pretty key to getting us back on track. And so and small businesses are really worried about that. Can
you talk a little more about where it is hitting the hardest? Is it by province? I mean, do you see any discernible difference in what your business members tell you in Alberta versus what they tell you in Quebec, where I would say Alberta has some of the least restrictions, whereas Quebec has some of the most restrictions? Is it restaurant retail tell you one thing, but your agriculture sector and your manufacturing sector tells you something else? Can you break that down a bit for us?
Yeah, certainly some differences, more differences by sectors than by province, although interestingly, businesses may be a little bit more open and less restricted in the Western provinces in general have been a little bit less restrictive right from the beginning. However, Alberta, we've got only 20% back to normal revenues. So there are other things factoring into that. Likely, but things are by and large a little bit more consistent across regions than they are by sector. By sector, you have huge variations where you have hospitality. Anyone in the hospitality sector, whether you're catering, restaurants, hotels, that sector has been hit very hard. Arts and recreation, so your dance studios and your gyms have also been hit very hard. Overall, we see the risk of permanent closure for small business right now is about 1 in 7, and that's on top of the businesses you've already seen close. So that's very, very high. But for some sectors, like, as I said, hospitality, it's 1 in 3 are at risk of permanent closure right now. So we really haven't seen anything this bad in a very, very, very long time.
Okay, we'll talk more about that, but let's just get Jocelyn in here. Jocelyn Bamford is founder of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Ontario. So Jocelyn, would you sort of parallel what you just heard Laura say, or is it a little bit different for those businesses that don't have the direct frontline customer retail kind of interaction? Tell us what you're seeing.
So a couple of things. First, I just wanted to say that we're now the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Ooh. So we've spread our wings. I heard you speaking this morning, and I have to agree with you. A Joe Biden presidency is terrible for Canadian manufacturing, and I'll explain why. His first priorities coming out is climate change. That's one of his top priorities. Yeah. And what does that mean? That means a furthering extension of what we've seen from the Canadian government, which is an attack on our resource sector. And why that's important to manufacturing is in Ontario, there's almost as many manufacturers that support the resource sector, making parts and pieces for the resource sector, than there are in automotive. So we see a large focus on making sure that the automotive sector is propped up in Ontario, but as equally as important are those folks that are in the supply chain of the resource sector, and that just doesn't seem to be getting a share of the discussion, and that's really important. And that is how one way that a Biden presidency is going to be bad on economics of Canada. And the second way is because Canada had very unaffordable energy for our manufacturers, many manufacturers started to open a branch plant in the United States. They did that because of high electricity in Ontario, which came as a result of the green energy policy and a Green Energy Act that we saw in Ontario, where we had manufacturers paying, like our company, 32 cents a kilowatt hour. So, an average bill would be $35,000 to $40,000, of which $25,000 to $30,000 was the global adjustment fee. And what was that global adjustment fee? That was what paid the wind and solar contracts that the McKitrick and wind liberals signed up. So they signed up wind and solar for 20 years at 90 cents a kilowatt hour when the going rate was between 4 and 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And that was primarily the burden was on the manufacturing. So we had some folks in our coalition that moved their business to the United States, say $400,000 on electricity. Now, fortunately, Ontario has addressed that, but every time the Ontario provincial government does something to keep and attract manufacturing, the federal government adds more cost on us. So we had a doubling in the pandemic. So we're in a pandemic and we have the doubling of the carbon tax. We have the clean fuel standards that they're pushing on it. They're pushing to declare plastics as toxic. What does that mean? That means that they're targeting the plastics industry, which is a $35 billion with a B dollar industry in Canada and almost 100,000 jobs. So if you take down the resource sector and you take down manufacturing because they're connected and you take down the plastics sector, you're taking down the middle class because those are high paying middle class jobs, and you're taking down manufacturers. And we have to remember in Canada, that 92% of all businesses are 100 people and below. So it's death by 1,000 cuts. Just when you think it can't get any worse, with COVID and our federal government, now we're going to see a mirroring of the same bad policies, which really saved a lot of companies in manufacturing. And one last point to that, a lot of people, because there were negative Canadian companies, because there was a negative policies in Ontario, opened up branch plants in the United States. And for a lot of them that did, they saw 80% of their growth coming from the United States. And now they're going to see that shut down. So then we see from the federal government their resilient recovery plan, which is, Gerald Butts and a bunch of academia and NGOs, environmentalists, telling the folks like our company who've been on the front lines of manufacturing product and have stayed open through the COVID, how we ought to reopen the economy. Well, we never shut down. We've been going. So instead of them telling us, perhaps they might want to come to us and say, what did you do to keep going? What procedures and policies did you put in place? Because we've been able to safely reopen throughout COVID, but they're not interested. They just want to push their very alt-left agenda on the rest of us, and it will be the detriment of our economy. So we came up with a better plan. We got a bunch of businesses together, and we developed responsible recovery. So it's a 6-point plan to reopen Canada and get us back to work. And we have such an amazing opportunity to bring back manufacturing to Canada. We all saw how vulnerable we were with not having ventilators, not having PPE manufactured here. So we could seize on that opportunity and bring back our manufacturers. And what do we need to do that? We need affordable energy. So our 6-point plan outlines how to get back to work, how to bring jobs back, and how to support the middle class going forward.
Are you able to zip through what those 6 points are, or are they too detailed?
So number one, I'll just cover a couple of key points. One is bring back manufacturing, understand the critical importance of having a supply chain in Canada for things like PPE. The other thing is to support our resource sector. So imagine we all saw what happened with us scrambling around to retool our plants for PPE. Now imagine in the next crisis, if we offshore our energy, we're not only going to have hospitals that don't have PPE or plants that don't have PPE, we're also going to have plants and hospitals that don't have energy because we've offshored the energy production, or we've decided to bury it in the ground. So the other thing is we need to get back to work. If you look at the manufacturing sector and the grocery sector and the healthcare sector, we've all worked through pandemic. We all put a whole bunch of new procedures. In the first 2 weeks, our plan has completely changed. Social distancing, we went to more lunch breaks. We've installed temperature checks when you come in, temperature checks at lunch with machines that record and also record who's in our plant, so we know if somebody's not in our plant that's not supposed to be. We jerry-rigged PPE in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. We figured it out. We always figure it out. Canadians are so resilient. We're so resourceful. We're so inventive. And we have all this knowledge of how we got back to work. We should share those best practices with the other sectors of the economy and have a sector-by-sector plan, not to shut down, but a sector-by-sector plan, how to return to work and the economy, because that's the only way we're going to get back to where we need to be.
Awesome.
So those are just some of the items that are in our responsible recovery plan. We encourage Canadians to sign on with this plan because we have to send a message to Ottawa that their plan, their resilient recovery, the Green New Deal, that is not the way to get back for jobs in the economy in Canada. And we have a better plan. So we encourage all Canadians to sign on to our responsible recovery plan and send a message to Ottawa that we have a better and more thoughtful plan.
All right, thanks for that, Jocelyn. I'm going to try to get everybody to weigh in on that point because this morning we were hearing from our American panel and Canadians on that American panel that because of the apparent gridlock of what we're seeing in the U.S., a Biden White House, the Democrats with a lesser majority in the House, and then the Republican Senate, that was going to be a recipe for him not to be able to pass all of the things that he wants to pass in his green agenda. And part of the issue there is if Biden is emboldened, then that will embolden our own prime minister walk in lockstep. That's some of the analysis that I've heard. So I want to get Ross McKitrick first to weigh in on this. We keep hearing the term build back better. It's a mantra that Chrystia Freeland used when she talked about decarbonizing the economy. It was the campaign slogan of Joe Biden. The World Economic Forum is holding a great reset forum in January, and they're talking about build back better. I think one of the aspects is building back without fossil fuels. Just give us your sense of this. Like, I don't know if that's just a bunch of people speaking aspirationally, or is this our new reality? Are we on a fast track now of eliminating fossil fuels? How do you see it?
Well, the way I look at it is that things that were a bad idea before the pandemic are still a bad idea. It's just people are opportunistically saying, well, now we're in a phase of recovery where we're looking at introducing policies to support the recovery, and people with this green agenda want to overload their ideas onto what should actually be an agenda running in the opposite direction, which is we really need to make a priority of profitable investment, business creation, job creation. In the past, for instance, 2008, there was a whole lot of climate policy on the agenda then, and a lot of policymakers around the world realized when the financial crisis hit, okay, we're going to put all that on the back burner because it's expensive. So now is not the time to do all that. That should be the reasoning now. And I think in the end, that's going to come out that with so much stress in the economy, when people realize how much things like the clean fuel standard cost, they're going to be unhappy that the government is choosing now of all times to implement these things. There's a lot of sloganeering around it. I mean, you said build back better and resilient recovery and all that. And really that's just using the this particular moment in the policy agenda where we're looking for governments to come up with a plan. It's kind of a Trojan horse where they can say, well, we're going to present a recovery plan, but it's actually just a whole lot of old shop-worn green policy ideas that were a bad idea previously, but we think we might be able to get away with it now because everybody's expecting us to implement a big policy agenda. Yes, I agree that with a change in the White House, that does embolden the Canadian government, although I don't think there is anything holding back our Canadian government up to this point. They've been pretty aggressive on this file, and I suppose they might get even more aggressive. I mean, things can always get worse, but they seemed to be pretty green in their focus and not concerned about the economic downside of a lot of their initiatives.
You know what, both you and Jocelyn have mentioned the clean fuel standard, and I'm still a little unclear on what it actually is. I think we all know, and you and I have talked about kind of an optimal level for a carbon tax. I think you've pegged it at somewhere between $10 and $20 without it impacting or impairing the economy. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But if I understand this clean fuel standard, is this sort of an extra carbon tax that is going to be hidden from us as retail consumers, but it's going to be levied on the large emitters? That's how I'm looking at it. And I think Dan McTeague has done some work on this, saying that it's going to be $350 per ton, which is kind of eye-popping and mind-boggling. I don't even know how business can manage that. So if you can just bridge my lack of information there, what is the difference between the fuel tax that I'm paying at the pump and on my natural gas heating bill versus this clean fuel standard?
Clean fuel standard is a rule that's going to be imposed on liquids and gaseous fuels and solid fuels as well, requiring them to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuels by with the final numbers to be determined, but 10 or 20% over the coming decade. And in order to do that, there's no way you can extract the carbon out of the fuel at the refining stage. All you can do is blend in biofuels of various kinds. So to comply with this, the makers of fuels, of gas and liquid fuels, have to ramp up their purchases of liquid biofuels and biogas, which is extremely expensive compared to conventional fuels. So that will push up the cost of fuels. But the government is also proposing a credit system to try. If they just go with their existing targets, it would be extremely large price increases. For instance, the Canadian Energy Research Institute in Calgary said natural gas prices would go up between 60 and 120% to comply with the clean fuel standard. So what the government has proposed is a credit system where refiners can buy credits. No one's really going to be in a position to sell credits, though, because it's expensive for everybody to try to comply with this. So there may be some unusual certification processes for people outside the fuel sector, but more likely they will just go to the government because the government has said we will be a credit supply of last resort. We will set the price. Right now they are talking about a backstop price of over $300 per ton. And so it would be like a carbon tax, only 8 times higher than it currently is. And it would apply to all fuels, so gas and liquid. There's a whole lot that just doesn't make any sense with this, including the fact that the point of a carbon tax is, love it or hate it, if you just have a carbon tax and none of these regulations, the economy figures out the cheapest possible way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in response to the tax. That's the whole economic logic of it. So if you put a carbon tax in, and then you do something like this, where you add a clean fuel standard, you've just wiped out all the economic efficiency of the carbon tax. You're just layering one on top of another. And there's even provisions within the clean fuel standard that are gratuitously expensive. For instance, right now, they're not proposing to allow credits to trade between the gaseous and the liquid streams, which, again, it just defies all logic of the policy. And the discussions have been all very hush-hush, very little public understanding of this issue. It's being raced along. I mean, it's a very fast train at this point. The government wants to have it in place very soon, and little in the way of public discussion or public debate, and even very little in the way of clear guidance. I mean, I've spoken to a number of people in various industrial sectors who are trying to figure out what it entails. And the odd thing is everybody thinks it's going to fall on someone else. I mean, everybody is thinking that they're going to cut some deal with the feds that will leave them out of it, and it'll all fall on somebody else. So I think in a way that's clever politics in Ottawa. They're letting people think that so that it doesn't trigger any big backlash. But this thing is actually going to hit, and it's going to be very expensive.
Wow. Okay. So I think Laura knows who it's going to fall on. Jocelyn seems to know who it's going to fall on. Laura, do you have any comment on that one? I wonder if it is going to be more the people that Jocelyn represents as opposed to sort of your frontline businesses that will feel this. But what are you guys doing on this clean fuel standard? Are you worried?
Well, ultimately, the price of bad policy does fall on all of us, sometimes disproportionately on one group versus another group. But I come back to how are we going to recover? I zoom out to the question, how are we going to recover? And I talked about consumer confidence being key to that. Well, how are consumers going to be confident if they don't have jobs? Like that, your confidence in your ability to spend and invest is around your having some economic security. And so I think that to the extent that we can make it clear how expensive these policies are, how misguided they are, what happens in terms of jobs, there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure not to go too far down these bad roads. But the challenge that Ross is raising, and I think it's a really important one with these, is just how fast some of this bad policy comes at us with a lack of transparency and a lack of debate. And, that is really worrying, whether you're talking about a plastics ban or whether you're talking about new fuel standards. And so obviously that's a big concern. But I do think that unemployment is going to be a big check on this, because right now our job numbers are artificially high. There's a big wage subsidy in place. And even the finance minister has said, we can't continue this level of pandemic support indefinitely. So we have support in place until June for wage subsidy that's been announced, and now a better rent program. That's good news, but we know that can't continue indefinitely, and that's going to require consumer confidence, which requires jobs, and real jobs, not jobs that we've made up in some fantasy land.
Jake, I'm going to go to you. I know that your colleagues have done a lot of work on environmental indicators, on the clean fuel standard. I'm thinking Ken Green. You do work on economic freedom of the world with Fred McMahon. So there's lots of, you do also sort of fiscal performance indicators. You've got all kinds of measures that you're looking at of how we're doing. In this sort of chaotic world that we're in, what is it that you are going to be looking for as a measure of whether governments are moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? We're layering on electricity costs, we're layering on the uncertainty of regulatory costs, we're layering on additional fuel costs. It does strike me that it's got to have an impact somewhere. How is that going to manifest?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes down to whether or not you're actually solving a lot of the problems that existed before the pandemic too, or you're just exacerbating the problems and kind of repeating the same mistakes. So we look a lot on the competitiveness side, on the regulatory side. We had a complex regulatory system that can be inefficient and unpredictable at times, can delay projects. That's always a drag on economic growth and can impede your economy. At the same time, on the competitiveness side, what we look for too on tax rates, we're uncompetitive with the United States and other countries around the world on things like personal income taxes and corporate income taxes, capital gains inclusion rates. So those are big challenges for Canada to deal with in the recovery stage regarding regulatory uncertainty and competitiveness. So I think those are kind of the two big things we really look for.
Okay, see if there's any glimmer of hope that we can look to. I remember back in the 90s, I think I was just talking about this with Troy Lanigan in the break, New Zealand hit a wall, said, gosh, we got to change things completely how we operate. Ralph Klein in Alberta took that lesson. All of our governments, didn't matter if they were Liberal or Conservative or NDP, all found the light when it came to balancing the budget. And so that can happen really quickly too. But is there someone you can point to? Like, where are we looking? Who has the answer for us?
Yeah, so if we look back at the 1990s, for example, that was a great example in the period of time. Across political stripes, really, you had the NDP led by McKinnon and Romano in Saskatchewan. You had the Klein government in Alberta, and then you had the Chrétien-Martin government under the Liberals at the federal level. And they reached really a near debt and currency crisis in the mid-1990s, and they recognized that they had a big problem. So what they actually did, all these different types of governments, they decided that they needed to reduce spending, they needed to stop debt accumulation, they needed to balance budgets, and they needed to focus on tax competitiveness. So if we look at the federal level, for example, that Chrétien and Martin government actually balanced the budget in basically 2 years. They reduced program spending by about 10% over a 2-year period. And what we saw actually at the same time is that they started to move towards that tax competitiveness. So they started reducing personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, and reducing that capital gains inclusion rate. And the result of that was actually the strongest economic growth between 1997 and 2007, strongest economic growth in the OECD, in the G7, and the biggest increase in business investment over that time. We had declining poverty rates, we had strong income growth, and double the rate of job creation in the OECD at that time. So, we can really look at that example in the mid-1990s of as an example of what we want to do in our economic recovery stage in Canada now.
I keep my fingers crossed, but I'm recognizing as well we've got different demographic pressures now. So at a time that we've got a shrinking population of young people coming into the workforce and a growing population of boomers who are going to need everything from additional supports to long-term care to additional hospital visits, I don't know, to now a national pharmacare program potentially. It seems like there isn't anyone talking about what we're going to do to bridge that gap. Is there anything that you're seeing as a modern example of a country that's got its fiscal house in order? Because if we're talking about these problems existing pre-COVID, COVID's made them worse, but was anyone getting it together pre-COVID so that we could look to them as an example? I'll stay with Jake for a minute and then I'll ask others.
Yeah, that's a great question. Particularly on the aging population and demographics challenge, that's going to be a big issue for Canada moving forward. We're going to face challenges on old age security and healthcare spending, both the federal and provincial level, obviously. I look to other countries like Australia. That's a very comparable country for Canada, both culturally, historically, size of their economy. They've been fairly successful, even throughout the pandemic too. They've had a much smaller percentage of their economy spent in government spending. They have a lower unemployment rate than Canada as well. So they've been doing some things in the pandemic and before the pandemic that I would look to it as an example. So Australia is definitely one of the better countries that performs on this. Okay,
let me go to Jocelyn now, because you started us off on the issue of the clean fuel centers. If you want to add more to that, you can, but I think we're all now sufficiently alarmed after hearing Ross McKitrick talk about it. But give me your idea. When you're looking at where is a manufacturing mecca, when you say to government, these are the policies you need to adopt to be like X. I mean, I think in the past, X used to be Ireland. I think Ireland had a very low tax, particularly for manufacturing, to attract it back. What are some of the ideas and policies that you're looking at from around the world that we could maybe draw some hope from?
So first of all, we need to have a national strategy on manufacturing. We don't have that. I think their national strategy is to drive us all out. So we have a very ideologically driven federal government that thinks that the resource sector, manufacturing sector, and the plastic sector are all no bueno for them. The faster they get rid of us, the faster they get to nirvana. But it's a false narrative, because you only have to look at Ontario and what happened with the Ontario experience, where they said, we're going to bring in all of these new green jobs that never materialized. And there's some prime examples right in Scarborough where I live. And the provincial government at the time gave large subsidies to wind and solar companies. One was a solar manufacturer. They had much hoopla, announced millions of dollars going to this company that was going to make solar panels. They hired hundreds of people, subsequently laid off hundreds of people, went into protection, bankruptcy protection, were bought out from another company, got a whole more set of subsidies, moved out to Eastern Ontario, into the Belleville area, and subsequently went bankrupt again. So all of these green jobs that they promised never materialized. You just need to look at the Ontario experience to say that this is a failed policy. And so we need to be alarmed that they're trying to push a failed policy of Ontario across the country so that everyone can share their pain. So how do we get out of this? We have a national strategy in manufacturing. We make sure, and key to that strategy needs to be affordable energy. So by layering on double carbon tax is not a great strategy to get manufacturers and investment to locate here. And then, further damaging that is that they have no problem other foreign countries bringing in their product that don't have to pay those carbon taxes, don't have tariffs on them to equalize things. And so really what they're doing is they're not addressing a cleaner planet. They're actually contributing to a dirtier planet because they collect parts and bring in product from areas that, like China, that don't have the environmental protection that we have. And in addition, they prevent us from getting our clean liquefied natural gas out to market so that places like China could come off coal and go onto natural gas. So their policies actually create the absolute opposite effect that they want to do. And they take prosperity out of our country and they take jobs out of our country. So we need to have a competitive benchmark landscape against what other manufacturers have to pay to operate. And then we have to work towards becoming more attractive place for manufacturers and for capital to be invested here in Canada. And I mean, how could we could do this so easily? If we got some of our resource projects through, there's a whole bunch of things that manufacturers could make. There's a whole bunch of jobs that people could have, and a lot of them are high-paying, high-skilled jobs. If we could abandon this ridiculous plastics ban, so what the federal government is trying to declare plastics as toxic, and if plastics were toxic, why would we wrap our food in it? It's utterly absurd, and it's a proxy war on the resource and fossil fuel sector. And Canada has great best practices. In fact, there was just the Vinyl Institute of Canada just instituted a recyclable medical plastic. So they take all of the medical plastics at a few hospitals. They're doing this right now. And they are giving them to a recycler to build new pieces and parts to have a circular economy. And that's the type of thing and technology and innovation that we should be celebrating and exporting worldwide. But instead, the federal government wants to get us out of plastics, get us out of the resource sector, get us out of manufacturing by making it too expensive and too painful and not protecting us from products that are coming offshore that don't have those protections. So, I mean, it's literally the most absurd policies I've ever heard of. We have demonstrated that they have failed, and they are not consulting with us. Just like in Ontario, when they brought out the green energy policy, they didn't consult with the industry because they're just going to tell us what we ought to do. They're not going to work with us to achieve their objectives. They're just going to quickly roll them out on us. And that is absolutely not the best way to get public policy done.
Jocelyn, I'm loving your perspective because I think in Alberta, we often feel like these policies are targeted against us and that Ontario, they never do anything to undermine their vote base in Ontario. Well, thanks for disabusing me of that notion. But let me go to Laura then and see if you're seeing anything at the provincial or local level, because I don't hold out much hope that we're going to change the view of Justin Trudeau, especially when he's got Jagmeet Singh and the new Annamie Paul, new leader of the Green Party, pushing him in the opposite direction. But is there anything that a province can do that would inoculate themselves from federal policy or create a bit of an oasis of attraction for business, regardless of what the federal government has done? I guess in some ways I've been kind of encouraged by the fact that the COVID response has been led pretty well by the provinces and municipalities, and the federal government has really been taking a back seat in coming through with any restrictive measures. They've been the ones writing the checks, but mostly they've respected provincial jurisdiction. Does that give us some other avenue for how we might see the recovery begin? Does the recovery begin at the provincial level?
Well, I think the recovery really begins, again, I'm going to sound maybe like a little bit of a broken record here, but I think the recovery begins with consumer confidence. And absolutely the provincial governments have a really important role to play because they're the ones, deciding, they're the ones communicating some of the health information. And, you can take the same information and you can communicate that in many different ways. You can provide enough context around it to help people make good decisions, or you can just use it to scare scare people. And so that's a really important role in terms of confidence, that people know, for example, where, what activities might be more risky, what activities are less risky, that when you're going to your hairdresser has a mask on and you have a mask on, and if they're standing behind you for most of the appointment, that's actually not a high risk activity. So they have an important role to play with consumer confidence. Obviously, they have an important role to play in some of the natural resource space and pushing for some projects to go forward. And we know that small businesses are very affected by those major projects and are very supportive of major projects, as long as the environmental balance is there, as long as there is some consideration for, for environmental concerns, that small businesses support that. So they have an important role to play there. But I think, we've talked a little bit about bad policy that existed pre-COVID, and let me talk a little bit about the municipal government, which is a level of government I'm very worried about, because for years we've been sounding the alarm bells that property taxes for small businesses have not been something that it's been easy. It's been very challenging for businesses to cope with property taxes that are often 3, 4, 5 times what an equivalently valued resident pays. And what you see is that those property taxes are falling disproportionately on businesses, not just small businesses, bigger businesses as well. And it's fueling a level of municipal spending that is way out of whack with population growth, with inflation growth. That's been going on for years. Now, I don't know how municipal governments are going to deal with this as we go forward. And I suspect they're going to be, they're already starting to knock on the door of senior levels of government to help them out of this mess. So I think that's going to be very, very challenging to cope with, because to date, they've been really it's fallen on deaf ears that maybe they have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. And now they're just going to say, we've got an even bigger revenue problem. And guess what? Taxpayers, you need to help us out through the senior levels of government. So that's an area that I'm quite worried about. But let me strike one note of positivity before I end, because I think it is tempting to. There's so much. Obviously, there's way more negative here than there is positive. But one of the positive areas is when you look at what's important for business and what's important for economic growth, there are 2 things that come up consistently for small businesses. One is taxes, and the second is regulation. And I do think that governments at all levels are starting to think a little bit differently about regulation. They've been pushed to do this. So let me stick with the municipal level of government. Patio openings all across Canada, getting permits in 48 hours instead of 6 months or 2 years, or we would never do that, so don't even ask us kind of time frame. That's a very different kind of thinking. And if we can encourage governments to continue thinking like that, and I've talked to a lot of people within government who say, what this has done for us is it's allowed us really to move from being so focused on the process around regulating and really thinking about the outcomes that we want to achieve. And so if we can leverage some of that thinking, maybe there's a note of positivity for me to add into all of the long, long list of things to be worried about.
Well, thanks for the work that you've done on the regulatory front, because I think when you say they've been pushed, they've been definitely pushed by you for many years. So I think I'm glad to see you're having some success. Let me pose 2 more questions, one to Jake and then one to Ross, and then we'll take your comments and questions. I'm just reminding you that we get to that section. So if you want to click on the chat and make a comment, or if you want to pose a question, I'll go over to Troy Lanigan in just a couple minutes here. But Jake, let me sound a note of positivity too, and just play a bit of the devil's advocate, because Jason Kenney on Friday basically said it's safer to go out to a restaurant than to entertain people in your own home. And I'm in the restaurant business, and I can just tell you, I'm also a CFIB member. Our revenues have been higher for the past 2 months than they were last year. And what I'm observing is that maybe it's because the government's put $2,000 in everybody's pockets and they can't travel. So what are they doing with it? Well, the only way to have a kind of a normal life is to go out and spend the money locally at a retail shop or online or at a restaurant. You're seeing as well, housing prices seem to be recovering as well. You're also seeing that people have paid off some of their debt because they've had a number of deferrals. So why not just keep doing that? Why not just have a universal basic income if that's giving a baseline level of consumer confidence? If you have to spend it locally, That's going to generate the jobs. It's going to generate the tax revenue. It's going to be taxed as well once we get into April. Maybe it's not such a bad idea. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. You know, obviously there's been a lot of discussion about something along the line of universal basic income or guaranteed annual income in Canada, mainly because of that Canada Emergency Response Benefit, giving people $2,000 a month. But, you know, some of my colleagues and I did an analysis because what we've seen is that there hasn't been that much discussion kind of about the costs and the incentives around this program. So we did a few different models. And we had a range of about 132 billion to 465 billion, depending on how you design the program. Obviously, there's a lot of different specifics. You know, nobody's really given those specifics of how they would actually design the program. So we just kind of used models like old age security or giving everybody $2,000 a month if they're between the ages of 18 to 64. And the PBO has also given estimates between 84 billion and 197 billion per year. For something along the lines of what we saw in Ontario with their pilot project, if you did that on a national scale. But there's also other concerns too with anything resembling a guaranteed annual income in terms of avoiding negative work incentives. If you have income thresholds and clawback rates that you introduce in there as well, you may actually be discouraging people from working beyond a certain income level because their benefits are getting taken away from them. And at the same time, if you want to try to restrain costs by maybe reducing the amount you give people, maybe you don't give them $2,000 a month, maybe you give them $1,000, well, then it might not actually be effective at alleviating poverty, which is mostly the goal that people suggest, the proponents suggest of the program. So you can run into a whole bunch of different incentive issues, not to mention just the sheer cost and scale of the program as well.
Let me finish off with our economist, Ross, and just see if there's any way that you could make a program like that work. Because I think there's sort of a notion that if you give this basic income to everyone, then you can find other efficiencies by eliminating other government programs. I think there is also, Milton Friedman said, if you do it as a negative income tax, so you basically act as a top up, that might be a way of introducing it to give that basic level of security without it costing too much money? Or is it just an idea that's a bomb from the beginning because we just frankly can't afford a new program? What do you think?
The idea of a negative income tax or the universal basic income, it has a nice logic to it, as long as what you're trying to do is get rid of these fiscal cliffs that a lot of low-income people face, where their income goes up a tiny bit, and then suddenly they face a clawback or a withdrawal of a whole bunch of services that they're dependent on. So we have, with the current patchwork of social welfare programs, some of the highest marginal tax rates are paid at the bottom end of the income scale. Because, as I say, you know, people, they go out and get a minimum wage job, and as a result, suddenly they're no longer eligible for food assistance and transit assistance and things that they might have had when they were in the welfare system. Mm-hmm. So if you could structure it, and you'd have to work with all the provinces and the municipalities. I mean, it'd be an enormous undertaking, and I think it's worth trying. But if you could have just a unified negative income tax type program and get rid of all those jumps in the support rates for people, then that addresses the disincentive for work, and it just turns the welfare system into the kind of support that we want it to be, but it also enables the transition into the workforce and continually gives people incentives to increase their labor force participation, rather than hitting some stopping point where they're worse off if they go and get further employment.
All right, let's see if Troy Lanigan has some comments or questions that have come in from you. Troy, go ahead.
Well, actually, it was just hit on, actually, the one question I had, and that is, if you are going to have support programs, what's the best way to design those so that you have the best incentives possible? You know, my son's 22 years old. He's done really well over these last few months. He's worked 2 jobs. He's worked in a grocery store and a liquor store. The grocery store was looking to hire, and none of his friends wanted to work because they had no incentive to work. And so I guess this is partly for Laura and Jake also. How to design these support programs in a way that rewards and gives the best incentives? Because a lot of, you know, even restaurant owners I've talked to at home have said it's been tough to get some people to come back to work. And that's not what we want either, because, as Laura says, that consumer confidence and everything that comes along with it is so important to the recovery.
Laura, do you want to start us off again on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the point about cliffs is an important one when you're talking about support programs, and that's true for individuals who need support, and also business owners who are dependent on some of the wage subsidy and the rent subsidy program. So, for example, with the rent subsidy, there was this huge cliff in the original program where you needed to be at a 70% revenue loss in order to qualify for the rent relief. And I know I talked to a number of business owners who were, they were in this terrible position where, of course, what they want to do is generate more business. But they said, if I take that contract or I do that job, that's going to put me on the wrong side. I'll have a 65% revenue loss and I won't qualify for the rent relief that I need in order to keep my business going forward. So a lot of that's been fixed in the small business relief programs, and I think that's a really, really good thing. It unfortunately makes some of the actual paperwork associated with those programs a little bit more complicated, but I think that's a fair trade for that incentive. And certainly what we're hearing from small businesses is there are a lot of them who are concerned that people don't want to come back to work because the help they're getting from government is, in some cases better than what they could make in a part-time job, for example, working. So I think eliminating those disincentives is going to be very, very important to the recovery and paying attention to them. And to give the government some credit, they certainly have done that. They've listened to us in that respect with the small business recovery supports, which is a good thing.
Jake, let me go to you because this might be a strange topic for us to have with the Free Enterprise, Free Market Fraser Institute talking about how to best design large universal government programs. But maybe we need to blow up the paradigm, really. Like maybe rather than just trying to tinker around the edges and find ways to modify programs slightly or slow the rate of increase, or cut strategically here or there, maybe we need to completely take a different approach. Maybe universality altogether needs to be thrown out the window. Maybe if you earn enough income to pay your own way, you should pay your own way. And we should be getting targeted programs to those who are most vulnerable, which would make the programs much smaller. I know maybe this is heresy because nobody seems to think that we can actually ever roll back the state. I know you guys have always resisted the growth in the state, so I just wanted to get your take on that. Do we need a completely different paradigm?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head with the targeting aspect. I think that's really important. Obviously, having income stabilization is important right now during the pandemic because of all the job losses and the work hours lost for people. But we have seen some poor targeting because a lot of it has been based on expediency rather than effectiveness and efficiency. So in the short term, that would be something that we would like to see, efficiency and effectiveness in spending. But in the long term, in terms of expanding things like, national pharmacare, national child care, guaranteed annual incomes and things like that, I think part of the problem in that is the cost, the price tags that you have associated with all of these things. And one of the only ways to actually reduce the cost of these programs is then to have negative incentives on working, and you may not actually be achieving your objectives with these social programs. So it's really complicated to balance all of these different things where you're trying to balance the cost, the price tag of something with also the incentives at the same time. So I think Laura made a lot of really good points. It's going to be important to solve a lot of the incentive issues, but it's not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination.
Ross, I tend to be inspired by Ayn Rand, who thought the only role for government was national defense, law courts, and police services. So my idea of what government should do for me is pretty small, but we're stuck with the system that we've got. If we were to sort of just be able to have a blank slate and start from scratch, what would we do differently? How would we create a fiscal framework that actually brings expenses in alignment with revenues? Is there some sort of ideal that we should be striving for?
There's a lot to that. As far as the taxation system goes, economists have certainly identified that some types of taxes are far more damaging and distortionary. Generally speaking, consumption taxes are better than income and profits taxes because they don't take away the incentive to put the effort forward and invest in work. But they're unpopular, and so you hit limits of what's popular versus what's efficient. On the spending side, I do think that if we look at, for instance, the social welfare support system, there's this huge proliferation of programs, partly because every government likes to introduce a new piece of the puzzle, but you end up with these very inefficient programs that can just as easily trap people in poverty as get them out of poverty. If there's a rule of thumb that we can try to teach policymakers to think about, it comes down to think about the costs and the benefits. Don't just keep looking at the benefits and say we're going to go ahead with something because it has some benefits attached to it. You know, I was thinking as we were talking about, you mentioned a pharmacare program. Jocelyn has brought up the fact that in Ontario, the Ontario government has just changed the electricity pricing system so that they are going to take a portion of the global adjustment out of the electricity price and basically put it on the public sector. So it's now going to be funded by the provincial government. So that will reduce electricity rates for a lot of businesses. I think it also brings a bit of transparency. Now people realize it's about $6 billion a year that is going to fund the remainder of these contracts. That's a pharmacare program. And we're spending all that money and all we're getting for it is the same electricity that we had before and largely the same generating system that we had before. Most of what we're getting is some wind power that we have to export at a loss because we can't use it when it is generated. So that's $6 billion a year for this misadventure in green energy. And so as a result, you know, people might think, well, it was worth it because we felt so good at the time that we were going green with our electricity system. And I think people need to understand, okay, that's a pharmacare program that we're not going to have because we are spending that money to pay off these contracts that we never needed in the first place.
Great point. Laura, as you know...
And can I just want to add to that, because that is an absolutely true and a story that needs to get out. But be not... be aware that this is a very well-funded, well-thought-out strategy. And currently, right now, environmentalists are going to the municipalities and trying to have them declare that they're going to come off natural gas, which is horrifying. So you know, they've sent their warriors out to absolutely destroy our resource sector, and they've done it at a municipal level where many municipalities have very left-leaning councillors now, a lot of them supported by some of these environmental groups. And so there's a concerted effort to go after our resource sector that we need to be aware of and we need to push back on. And Dan McTagg from Canadians for Affordable Energy has done some great work. I know Ross has done some great work to raise those alarm bells. But we need to get organized. You know, if we could get the manufacturers in the resource sector and the plastic sector all together to push back against these policies, we may get some traction. But unfortunately, a lot of multinational corporations won't speak out. They won't speak out because, you know, they prefer a global marketplace. They prefer moving jobs to jurisdictions that don't have great environmental standards. So it's incumbent upon the small to medium-sized business, because we're the ones that are here and we have long-term relationships with our employees. We have closer relationships with our employees because they're our family. And so it's really incumbent upon us to come together and really push back against these terrible policies that will ultimately cost jobs. And they'll cost jobs not only for our employees and their families, but for our kids, and it will take away their future, and it's not acceptable.
You know what? That's a mic drop, Jocelyn. I think you had the best line to end things off. Thank you so much. That was Jocelyn Bamford, founder of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Laura Jones, Chief Strategic Officer and Executive VP of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Ross McKitrick, Professor of Economics, University of Guelph. And Jake Fuss, who is economist with the Fraser Institute. That's it for me. Handing it off to Troy Lanigan. Thanks, guys.